watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
Hello, I'm Mark Golub, and one of the things we enjoy doing most on Israel Speaks is to give you the chance to meet and to share the ideas and insights of Israelis whose names may not be familiar to you, but they're individuals who are helping to shape Israeli life today, and quite frankly, to give Israelis the opportunity to address issues of critical importance to the state of Israel in their own voice. So often we only get to hear American Jews or American journalists offer analysis of events in Israel. It's good to hear thoughtful Israelis help set the record straight. So we'd like to introduce you now to a very special man on the Israeli scene, the editor of the editorial page of the Jerusalem Post, Elliot Jager. Elliot was born in New York City and holds an M.A. in International Relations and a Ph.D. in Political Science from New York University. And Elliot is one of the leading analysts and commentators on the Israeli scene today, and his website, which you should definitely check out, describes his work as out-of-the-box thinking on Jewish civilization, politics, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Elliot Jager, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very, very appreciative.
Thank you,
You're
Mark.
somebody I've wanted to meet for a long time, and this is very, very kind of you.
Ditto, thank you.
Thank you. Can we talk just one moment about you?
Sure.
You are from the Lower East Side. Literally, where'd you grow up?
Born and bred. I grew up on Avenue D.
Avenue D.
What's called Alphabet City. And when things got really, really tough there, we were able to find an apartment in the projects on the other side of the bridge, the Vladeck housing projects on Madison Street, and then we pulled ourselves up and got into the co-ops on Grand Street. So that's the history of my rise on the Lower East Side.
Okay, and you grew up in a very Orthodox setting.
I grew up in a very traditional Orthodox setting. I used to daven I went to worship in what's called a shtibel that belonged to the Sasava Rebbe, a Hasidic shtibel. Later on, I was a member of the East Side Torah Center, which at the time was a dramatic change because the rabbis spoke in English, and wore a suit and tie and was clean shaven. A rabbi by the name of Rabbi Seymour Nolman. So there was this move from the Sasava Rebbe, Hasidic Rebbe with a long white beard, to Rabbi Nolman, clean shaven, meticulously dressed with a white shirt and a starched shirt and tie, and that was my transition.
A major difference.
It certainly was.
Dramatic.
It certainly was.
You're here, you'll be visiting some of the guys you were friends with.
That's right.
From way back?
My friends from before I was bar mitzvah were still friends. A lot of people stayed on the Lower East Side. There's an enclave, a very strong Jewish enclave on the Lower East Side. You know, in the old days, at the turn of the 20th century, there were 500,000 Jews living on the Lower East Side. A lot of people obviously left, a lot of changes. Now there's changes for the better, gentrification, but there was always an enclave. On Grand Street and East Broadway, roughly 10,000 apartments where mostly traditional Jewish people live, and that enclave remains, and and it's worth coming down and having a look at it, and that's what I'm going to do. Haven't been back in years.
So, Elliot, at what point do you make Aliyah, and why?
Well, I have to back up and explain.
Please.
I first went to Israel in 1976, and you either get the bug or you don't. And I got the bug, and I got it big time. And I lived my life in the United States, but my heart and my soul were in Israel. And, you know, personal issues, family responsibilities keep you in a certain lane of life. And it really wasn't until 1997, with changes in my personal life, and my mother passed away, and I didn't want to leave when she was, and she couldn't go to Israel. In 1997, I decided, well, it's either, at my ripe age, it's either now or never. And so I wanted to bring in sync my personal life and my emotional life and my spiritual life and my political life with where I was physically stationed. And so I went to Israel in 1997. and I connected those two elements of my life, and I've been very, very fortunate because while I was in Israel, I remarried. I met a wonderful woman whose name is Lisa Clayton, and we live in Talpiot in Jerusalem, and I began working for the Jerusalem Post. You have to retool when you make a move like that. And it's been a wonderful Jerusalem Post family, and it's been a wonderful
I'm so happy
and
for you.
intense experience. It's
am
never
so-
boring.
Very
It's never
good.
boring.
All right. I appreciate your sort of setting the stage for us. I have one more stage setter to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you consider yourself Orthodox to this day?
No. I am a member of a conservative congregation, Moreshet Avraham. In Israel, we call it Mesorti.
Traditional.
Right. And I am observant and a member of the Mesorti congregation, both for primarily for theological reasons.
I understand.
But also, yes, it's a strange transition because most of the time, as you know, people tend in this day and age to move further to the theological right.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have young people who are more orthodox or more traditional than their parents. I don't consider myself less traditional, but I've decided to be happy with both my theology and my practice, and I'm a member of a wonderful congregation. We have a wonderful rabbi, and the Mesorti movement is rather small in Israel, but we have a purpose-built synagogue and a very vibrant community.
Is this in Talpiot?
It's in East Talpiot, right over the Green Line, I like to tell people.
Very nice.
It's where we have many leaders of the rabbinical movement of the conservative Jewry who happen to be living in our neighborhood. It happens to be the place to be, East Talpiot, if you want to be part of a very vibrant conservative community.
And now what about you in terms of the political spectrum? Do you consider yourself to be right, center, or left?
Center. That means you get hit by cars going in both directions. The truth of the matter is in Israel today, the left asks the wrong questions and gets the wrong answers, and the right asks the wrong questions and gets the wrong answers. And I think the center is actually where most Israelis want to be.
I want you to say that again, because that's my sense too, and I was going to ask you. My sense is that the vast majority population, the average Israeli across the board, really is more center than ideologically left, and certainly than ideologically right. Do you agree with me?
I absolutely agree with you. That does not mean that then of course you have to ask where the center is. The center is substantially to the right of where it ever was before. But so we have a center we have a majority, a mainstream Israel, centrist Israel that's moved substantially to the right, so that's where the center is. The right itself, the ultra-right, has moved way out in right field, and the left is either where it was or out in left field, and both essentially don't speak to the issues that really we need to address.
You know, we here in America always are looking at the New York Times as the newspaper of record.
Right.
And the editorial page of the New York Times
Right.
is either revered or reviled.
Right.
Okay. The Jerusalem Post is primarily an English language paper, correct?
Exclusively in English, although
Okay.
we have a French edition, we have a Christian edition, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Whom is your audience in Israel? Is there an audience in Israel?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you were to spend Shabbat at an English-speaking family, you'd see the big Jerusalem Post Friday edition on the coffee table. We have most of our readers are native English speakers who want news that's written and reported in original English. And so we're the only paper that does that. And so we have daily, we come out 6 days a week. Shabbat we rest. And of course we have an extremely popular website, as you know, www.jpost.com, which is one of the biggest websites.
It's one of the major websites in the Jewish world
for
now.
people interested in
Yes.
Israel issues, right?
Okay, so what do Israelis who read the Jerusalem Post say about the editorial page? And I ask you now, as someone who grew up in America, and you know how American Jews talk about the editorial page of the New York Times. So
Right.
the question is, do people say it's gone too much right? Do they say it's come back too much left? What do they say about you now?
Well, let me just separate the editorials themselves, which are the position of the newspaper, and the opinion pages of the Jerusalem Post. under the leadership of David Horowitz, who is our editor-in-chief, the opinion pages of the Jerusalem Post make it a point to carry balance
Absolutely.
virtually every single day. If we have someone writing from the left, we have somebody writing from the right. And this is across the board, whether it's theology or politics or social issues. That's his mandate. So I think that's one of the things that actually distinguishes our op-ed pages from the op-ed pages of some of the major newspapers here, and that is you don't just throw in a token liberal or you don't just throw in a token conservative, but you make it a company policy to have blend every single day. And if it's not on that day, then you certainly make up for it the next day. Now, as far as the editorials themselves, that what the British call the leaders, the position of the newspaper, which again is guided by the thinking of David Horowitz, we take a centrist position on, although we lean, people say we lean to the right on security issues. But in terms of, for example, pluralism, social issues, we tend to lean center, I would even say
Slightly to the left.
right.
Right.
Because, so it depends on the issue, and I think we tend to be pragmatic, we tend to weigh the issue on its merits rather than have a sort of knee-jerk ideological reaction. And you may know that the Post has gone through a transition over the years. It was considered left-wing when it was owned many years by the Histadrut. In fact, I'll tell you, Mark, it happened that years ago, if you talk to some of the old-timers, they'll tell you that the foreign minister of Israel, Moshe Sheret, used to come right before the paper went to press, and he'd go over the editorial to make sure that it towed the company line. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Post shifted to the right, and now I think the Post has sort of gotten to the golden mean,
but it's come of age in many ways because of Horowitz.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
he's the guy. Look, I'm not saying this simply because he's my boss. He's the guy who's probably the best qualified English language editor in Israel, and there are a lot of people who would love to have him come edit their paper in England or in the United States, and we're kind of lucky that he's with us.
Okay. It was important for me that our audience understood this context,
Right.
because now I want to do issues with you.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
And I want to go backwards. In some way, I would normally ask this question at the end of an interview. But given who you are and the sense we have of each other, I want to begin with the last question first. You choose. What's the issue which American Jews misunderstand most about the Israeli scene today, which if you had the chance to sort of shake American Jews and say, no, you don't get it. I don't want to even steer you into a specific area. What would you want us to know that you think is our most serious misconception about the Israeli scene today?
That Israelis are not just like American Jews.
You're not just like Americans.
That's right.
In what way?
American Jews tend to think of each other as sharing middle-class values, and so the difference is that in Israel you've got Jews from across the board. You've got Jews who share these middle-class values that are very common to American Jews. I'm not talking simply that you're economically middle class, but you aspire to sort of bourgeois middle-class values, politeness, and all of the other things that go with valuing education, courtesy, and so on and so forth. Israelis, you've got a wide spectrum of Israelis. I suppose one of the hardest things to accept when you go to live in Israel is in the United States, when you hang out with other Jews, they tend to have values just like you. But when you go to Israel and you're driven around by a bus driver or a cab driver, or you cross the street and you're surrounded by Jews, they're not just like you. They come from all sorts of backgrounds, have all sorts of different values. That Israeli society runs the gamut. Similar in many respects to American Jewish society in sharing these middle-class values, but on the other hand, there are many poor people who don't share these things. There are people who are fallen away from Jewish tradition. That's another thing that I think is somewhat that people need to understand. many Israelis are disconnected from Jewish tradition.
How did that happen?
That's a good question, Mark. How did that happen? The irony or the paradox is that for many years, the portfolio for the Ministry of Education went to the National Religious Party. And they focused their patronage as much as possible when it came to Jewish content in the public schools toward the religious sector. And they abandoned in large measure the rest of the school system. And so you have today Israeli young people growing up who are essentially on a Jewish level illiterate, Jewishly illiterate, although they speak Hebrew. And so that's another thing that people discover. There's a disconnect between, I mean, here, of course, the effort is on Jewish education, and you want people to connect to their heritage. And the irony of ironies is many Hebrew-speaking Jewish people in Israel who walk in the land of our forefathers don't know, don't understand. And so that's one of the things that I think people here need to understand, that Israeli society is complex. It runs the full gamut of any society with all of the good and all of the bad, and we got to build on the good.
I want to talk more about this Jewish issue. There was, in the early Zionist vision, a sense that simply living in Eretz Yisrael, living on the biblical land, from Ben-Gurion's perspective, which was reflected in many of his colleagues, just living in the land was enough. There were many who came from Eastern Europe who had a Jewish background, and they didn't want it. They wanted to be almost Jewish universalists. And it was all about the soil. And the soil itself would make somebody Jewish. What you're saying, Elliot, is that over time we've learned that as wonderful as it is to walk the land of our forefathers, our ancestors, it's not enough to make an Israeli a Jew.
That's right. Jewish civilization, what we have to cherish is this idea of Jewish civilization, a common heritage, and something that unites us. And many Israelis are ignorant, just as many American Jews are, of course. Many Israelis are ignorant of that very important heritage. And yes, simply sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv and speaking Hebrew, or riding your bicycle on Yom Kippur, which is what many Israelis do, or shooting water guns on Shvuot, which is what many secular Israelis do, that has sort of warped into the sort of twisted tradition of what happens when people are disconnected from their heritage. And obviously, I need to say that we have a tremendous, thriving spiritual world in Israel, a potpourri of spiritual opportunities of unbelievable proportions. So I'm sort of focusing, because you asked me, what are the kinds of things that would surprise or...
Yes. You're not saying Israel is a Jewish wasteland.
Oh, heavens no.
Okay, but you are saying
Quite the
that
contrary.
it is significant that there is a significant Jewish population, Israeli population, which is not connected, and I'll now use a word you'll understand and many of our audience will understand. They're not connected to Torah.
They're not connected to Torah.
Okay, and I'm talking about the Torah. I'm talking about Torah in a general sense.
Yes.
That when it comes to Jewish values, Jewish identity, Jewish center,
Yes.
that's not who they're Israeli, but not necessarily Jewish.
In that sense, you're right.
Okay, and I would also love to know from your perspective, to what extent do they feel connected to Jews in the diaspora, not only in America, but in France and in England and in South America and in Australia? To what extent do the Israelis we're now talking about, those who are lost a bit, to what extent do they understand they're part of a people, a nation, that although there are Israelis, there are Jews in Israel, there are Jews all over. To what extent do they feel connected?
Well, Mark, that's just exactly the point. If you don't feel connected to Jewish civilization, then what is your connection to people who have some sort of Jewish connection in France? Maybe it's a very tenuous connection, and that's precisely the problem. And of course, it's a two-way street. Where if you have people in the diaspora who don't have a strong connection to Jewish civilization, they're not connected with other Jews in the diaspora, and they're certainly not connected with Israel. So the answer is a very tenuous connection.
Okay. How serious a problem is this from your perspective?
Oh, I think it's immensely serious
Because?
because look, we are, at the end of the day, we are in Israel because it's at the core, I believe it's at the core of Jewish civilization. It's the core of the covenant that makes the Jewish people. Now, whether or not you look at the covenant as something literal, or whether or not you look at the covenant as a sacred myth, it's almost irrelevant. It goes back prior to Christianity, prior to Islam, prior to many of the traditions that exist today. It is an organizing principle of a people that survived for thousands of years, this idea of the land of Israel and the people of Israel and the God of Israel. And so that is a fundamental, that gives our lives meaning. And for people who can't connect to that on any level, and you well know that you can connect to Jewish civilization. It's a friendly civilization. You can connect on a level of orthodoxy. You can connect on a level of secularism. You can connect on any level, on a language level, on a cultural level, on a musical level. But if you don't want to connect at all, if you don't know to want to connect, then you're lost, and that's a tragedy.
Can something be done about it?
Well, obviously what needs to be done, and this gets a little complicated, but one of the problems we have with Judaism in Israel is that it is represented by the established church. And the established church in Israel is the Orthodox rabbinate. And the Orthodox rabbinate, frankly, has done an excellent job of pushing people away from what we call Yiddishkeit, of pushing people away from Jewish tradition, because of the aridity in which they promote the Jewish tradition, because of an extraordinary hypocrisy, because of a certain level of corruption, because of an insensitivity to people who want to become closer to the Jewish people. And so this establishment, which initially served a useful purpose, has now become not only superfluous, but it's become counterproductive. And as you know, Mark, when you come to Israel, if you want to get married, you have to go through the rabbinate. If you want to get buried, you have to go through the rabbinate. If you want to get divorced, you have to go through the rabbinate. There's no civil family court system. And the rabbinate has become essentially corrupted. And in that way, it turns people off. So when Israelis who have no connection and don't see the bigger picture look at Judaism and they connect to the rabbinate, they said, I don't need this. Thank you very much. This is not what I need. So what we need to do is essentially to do away with the rabbinate, to make Judaism a much more open market, free market, expressive, spiritual, inviting a phenomenon, and that will bring people in to Jewish tradition and Jewish civilization on any level that works for them.
Elliot, when Israelis talk to you, I'm talking about Sabras now.
Right.
When Israelis who have been born in Israel meet you, interact with you, do they still think of you as an American Jew?
Absolutely. I open my mouth and I can be speaking in Hebrew and they'll answer me in English. There's no question about it. I mean, that's the funny thing about when I was here most of my life, I felt like I didn't quite belong. I mean, I had wonderful friends. No, I didn't quite belong. I get there, they let you know you don't quite belong, So
Okay.
That's the answer.
That's a wonderful answer. I asked the question because as an American Jew, and again, even from an Israeli perspective, you're still an American Jew, you understand the phenomenon of Jewish pluralism.
Yes.
My experience with Israelis is, it goes something like this. If you're going to be quote, they use the word religious.
Right.
If you're going to be a religious Jew, you're going to be Orthodox, and I'm not going to be Orthodox.
Right.
Therefore, I am going to abandon the only Jewish alternative, which I, as an Israeli, believe is authentic. And that you, Elliot, with your Masorti movement or with HUC's presence in Jerusalem and all over the country, you're an American Jew who's here, you don't get it. And for whatever reason, non-Orthodox styles of Judaism, which have worked in America, have not yet worked in Israel.
That's correct. Most Israelis are either secular or non-practicing Orthodox. That's what they amount to, either secular or non-practicing Orthodox, because they haven't given some serious thought to to what the role of religion is, because it's become warped essentially through the rabbinut. So it is a tragedy that rather than participate in a Jewish framework, they participate in nothing at all. And I do think that. Don't you think that's a tragedy?
Absolutely. But wait, everything you're describing is so sad.
Yes.
I don't believe it's over. I believe that there are ways that this can be addressed, but it will not be addressed, as you point out, unless there's a different political system in Israel.
Yes.
Yes?
Absolutely. We need to change the political system. We need to change the electoral system so that it will empower sort of moderate, pragmatic influences and modernizing political parties, and bit by bit reconstitute this entire relationship between church and state, or synagogue and state in our case.
I want to do an adjacent issue, and I don't know where you're going to come out exactly. I want to understand the way, from your perspective, the vast majority of center Israelis, as you've described them, view and relate to the settler community.
Okay.
How does the typical Israeli, who, and you'll also tell me if I'm wrong, my sense is that the experience, whether it's with Oslo or whether it was Camp David when Barak came and met with Arafat and Clinton, whether it's the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza and the fact that now Israel lives with shelling on Sderot and Ashkelon all the time, that most center Israelis have less hope that in the present political climate in the Palestinian world, that peace is possible in some realistic way. Do you feel I've generally got it right?
You've got it, I think, as far as I'm concerned, 100% on the ball.
Okay.
100%.
Then the question is, what does this center group, the center majority in Israel, how do they view the settler group, the settler community? As you and I are meeting now, there have been clashes in Hebron between extreme settler groups and the Israeli army, the Israeli police, trying to evict them from building. It almost doesn't matter what the issue is. There's always an issue.
Right.
To what extent are Israelis sympathetic, or just, they've had it with the settler community?
Well, I was in Hebron just a little while before I came to the States, right before the house was. This is a story about a house in Hebron that was disputed. The legality of who owned it was disputed, and the settler community wanted to hold on to the house. They were ultimately violently evicted. The background people can sort of check out on Google, and if they are interested in the background. But I went to the house, and I went to Hebron, in fact, along with David Horowitz. We spent a good number of hours there.
When? During this entire clash?
That was 2 days before, yes. We went to Hebron to talk to the people in the house, and to try to understand what they wanted, and also in order to try to understand how to develop our editorial policy towards the issue. You want to go and see what's going on. You want to talk to the people involved. You want to talk to all sides. That's the sort of the way we do.
But forgive me, Elliot. Yeah. What didn't you know? What did you need to hear from them that you didn't know?
It's a good question. Let me put it to you this way. Hebron has some of the most dislikable settlers that you can possibly want. These are the not nice settlers. But the fact of the matter is that if these not nice settlers are pulled out or leave, it means that we lose access to the cave of the patriarchs, the Machpelah. So it's a balance. You have to be nutty to want to live in Hebron, because what are you doing? You're living in a sea of Arab hostility, right? So who would want to live in such a sea of hostility with their children, to leave their little children walking around amidst an unbelievable, that's where Hamas is most popular, right? So you got to be a little nutty, right? So we have to figure out a balance between how do we have access to, this was the first capital of Israel. This was the first piece of property. Hebron, where the cave of the patriarchs is located, Hebron. This was the first piece of Jewish property in Jewish sacred history, right? This was the first capital of Israel, was Hebron, right? So you got all these nutters that live in Hebron. And part of you, what you ask, why did you go there? Because part of you says, I'm with you. That's why. Because part of you says, I'm with you. And part of you says, but we live in a modern Zionist state. and their rules of the game. And even if the courts are unjust, and even if the prime minister is corrupt, imagine that. Even if all those things happen, you still have to live by the rules of the game. And so, in a sense, we went to get a flavor for that and to try to understand that.
You asked that question of the settlers?
Yes, and they say that, and the settlers said that we spoke to, look, if you guys really don't want us here, then you should say you don't want us here. But don't play with the police and the courts in order to make our lives miserable. We've played by the rules, and you change the rules. And you know something, there's something to that.
That's correct.
To that position.
That's correct.
So, but as far as the bigger issue about the settlers, I think what people need to understand is that the settler community is homogeneous. Excuse me, it is heterogeneous.
It's not all the same.
It's not all the same. The majority of, here's something that a lot of folks don't know, the majority of settlers who live over the Green Line, the majority of Israelis who live over the Green Line, and I've lived over the Green Line, the majority are peaceable, moderate, patriotic. Many of them are not even observant, they're not traditional. So, I mean, there's a misconception about, people think of the nutty settlers and think of that's the settler community. And most settlers are not that at all. And most settlers live legally from the Israeli point of view. They live in legal homes with the endorsement of the Israeli government, and the Israeli government provides them with water and electricity and voting and so on and so forth. So most Israelis living over the Green Line are doing so at the behest of the government of Israel. Now, what Israel has a problem with is Israel needs to make some tough decisions about where its borders will be. We can't do it with the Palestinians because the Palestinians simply don't want to cut a deal. And so we have our problem about that. So I think most Israelis, like many American Jews, are fed up with the settlers because most Israelis don't travel over the Green Line. They don't go, they don't see, they don't understand that most settlers are decent, patriotic people. I lived, for example, for about 6 months in Shiloh, right? Which again was another capital of Israel long before Jerusalem, right? And there are communities, beautiful communities there. Again, the other thing is these are beautiful communities. People pull together. They're, in many ways, they're like kibbutzim. They're like the kibbutz life that people idealize. You know, many of the kibbutzim have fallen apart, but the yishuvim, the settlers, and the settlements themselves are really, in many ways, beautiful communities where people help each other out, where there's a tremendous amount of spirituality. There are some settlements like Tekoa, which mix Orthodox people and non-Orthodox people, where the rabbi tries to go off and commune in the desert and tries to be friendly with the local sheikh, with the local Muslim imam. So,
what's your sense of Efrat?
Efrat is a bedroom community of Jerusalem. It is part of the Gush Etzion settlement block. It is essential that block stay within Israel, regardless of any deal that we make with the Palestinians.
Somehow it'll be carved out, we hope.
If it's not carved out, there must not be a deal.
Okay. But my point is, Efrat also tries to have a relationship with the Palestinian neighbors.
Yes.
Yes.
Very difficult now, though.
Yes.
Very
Okay.
difficult now.
But I want to come back to the problem.
Right.
Okay. Because what you've said is so important. I really hope our audience hears. There's a vast number of settlers who are simply Israelis who live on the east side of the Green Line, what is called the West Bank.
That's
okay?
right. That's right.
But unfortunately, there is also an element of the settler community represented, as you said, sort of the most extreme, if not, and I'm saying what you said. These are the group you're critical of.
Right.
They represent something that is not in your mind necessarily beautiful, even if there's an idealism to them.
Right.
Okay. But I open up a Jewish newspaper here in America.
Right.
And I see a photograph. The photograph is of a young man in a black mask and a black hood throwing rocks.
Right.
And lo and behold, the caption says it's an Israeli settler.
Yes.
And there's something about it, Elliot, which just, to me, is all wrong. There's something all wrong with this picture. And I'm going to ask you two questions. Number one, do you react to it as I do? First of all, do you?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then the more important question is this, and I've been waiting to ask somebody with your background. There is an element in American Jewry who claim that the individuals we see in the newspaper are not real settlers, that they are provocateurs who've been sent in either by the far left to make the settlers look bad, or that Shabak has its own operatives, a la the guy with the Nazi sign after Rabin's assassination, and that, in fact, settlers are not the ones who are inflicting violence against Israeli soldiers and Israeli police. My reaction to that is that's an ideological, emotional reaction, not an honest, on-the-ground reaction. You were in Hebron. You deal with this all the time. I want you now, as an Israeli, to speak to the issue. To what extent is there some kind of duplicity here, and that it's the Israeli government and the Israeli left which wants to turn the Israeli people against the settlers, who then are the ones who are doing the most extreme violence?
What you've asked me is one of the most complicated issues to untangle, so you'll have to bear with me and help me out as we sort of pull it apart. The radical left is indeed troublemaking in the West Bank.
It is.
Of that, there's no question. I don't know how many people understand that organizations here that have such a nice-sounding name like Peace Now are actually largely funded by foreign powers. Now, they have an agenda. They have airplanes. They are an intelligence organization in and of themselves, and they have an extraordinary propaganda arm. And there's no question that there has been an effort to demonize the settlers by the ultra-left to make the idea of living in Judea and Samaria sound somehow unpatriotic and violent. So of that there is no question. The settlers, decent people, have been demonized by the left, and now when you read the word settler in the New York Times, the connotation is negative. So they've achieved their goal with the support, by the way, of foreign governments, which have invested heavily, financially heavily, in a multitude of so-called Israeli NGOs to demonize the settlers. So
what's their goal?
To get Jews out of the West Bank.
Because?
Because, let's give them credit, because they believe in the idea of trading land for peace. They believe in the idea that the Arabs want peace, and that the only way you can ever trade land for peace is if you remove the Jews from the land that you want to trade. So let's give them that much credit. Put aside whether the Arabs want peace. Now, as far as the Israeli government is concerned, obviously the Israeli government has to try to know what's going on within the radical settler community. So I have no doubt that the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence service, tries to infiltrate what's going on. Do they serve as agent provocateurs? I have no idea. I would hope that that is not the case. I would pray that that's not the case, and I'd like to believe that that's not the case.
Have you ever heard it is the case?
I've only heard it's the case in connection with the Rabin assassination, with regard to not the, God forbid, the assassination itself, but some of the provocative actions that were taken. And there's no, by the way, there's no evidence on that. But you know, rumors have to take on a life of their own.
As if it's true.
As if it's true.
But Elliot, you're the editorial director of the Jerusalem Post. It's hard for me to believe, if there were hard evidence of this, you and some of your other colleagues at the Jerusalem Post would not have come across this.
Oh, I agree. I mean, again, I certainly don't think that the Israeli government is currently involved in trying to demonize the settlers. I think of that, let me be clear about that. I do not think that the Israeli government, whether even under Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak and Tzipi Livni, I do not think that there's a conscious effort to demonize. I think that unfortunately the settlers do enough to demonize themselves that this is not necessary. But let me just speak to that for a second. The reason you see this boy in the New York Times or in the New York Post
the Jewish Forward.
or in the Jewish Forward, the reason you see that image is he represents a certain caricature, a certain phenomenon. The phenomenon...
Well, caricature and phenomenon are two such different
He
words.
is a caricature of a phenomenon.
A caricature suggests it's not real.
No, he's very real. He's very real. He characterizes the phenomenon. Let me
Okay,
correct
very good,
myself.
good.
The phenomenon is, since disengagement, the phenomenon that he represents, and it's a minority of settlers who are the core of this problem, but they're surrounded by a larger population that is sympathetic and empathetic to this phenomenon. It swims in a larger sea. The phenomenon is a sense of profound alienation from the state.
Right.
Profound alienation.
In this faction of the settler community.
Yes. They feel so let down by the state of Israel. It's no longer the government of Israel. They feel so let down by having been pulled out of the Gaza Strip, having had their communities uprooted, and then to see the Strip used by the Palestinians to endlessly shell into Israel. That for them, they now feel that they didn't put up a fight. And for that, and for the way they were treated, and part of it was self-inflicted because they didn't cooperate, but put that aside. I'm simply trying to explain to you how they feel. They feel hurt and alienated. They feel the government is corrupt, and by the way, it is. You see? So, and they feel the courts are not on their side, and they're not, right? So all of these things play into each other, and they look at the corruption of the prime minister, and they wonder why he lasts so long, and they say to themselves, I bet you because he takes positions against the settlers. So there's this, no political system can be healthy if even a small but significant mobilizing chunk of the population feels that the regime itself is no longer legitimate. And that's what we have now among the settler community. So that's why you have this vitriolic anger, this rock throwing against Arabs and also against Israeli soldiers who they no longer consider to be representative of the cause that brought them or that mobilizes them.
You're explaining their mentality and their reasoning and even their emotional sensibilities.
Yes.
Are you justifying?
No, because as I tell my friends in the settler community, and I mean that they are my friends, I say to them that we've come so far, we've created a state, we're surrounded by enemies, and the idea of allowing anarchy to reign will bring about the third destruction of the temple. And I said to them that the prime minister may be a crook, the Supreme Court may be unjust, the rules of the game may be unfair, they may change them in the middle of the game in order to undermine you. All of the complaints you have may be true or partly true. I accept what you're saying, but I beg you, anarchy will destroy the Commonwealth. Don't allow the anarchy. Give in on whatever it takes so that the state of Israel can have time to reform itself, can improve itself.
Okay, I want to make the question harder for you.
Go right ahead.
Imagine an Israeli prime minister is elected for whom there's not a hint of scandal, a popular prime minister, and a straight arrow Supreme Court of the State of Israel says to the settler movement, it's not good for you to be in Hebron, in that specific building or that specific place. The settlers would react differently if that were true? Or would they still have pictures of, at the moment, young Israelis, young settlers, young Jews, adopting the style of the Palestinians?
I think you ask a very tough question. The answer, I mean, I asked a number of the settlers, something similar to what you've just asked me, and many of them said that they would stay anyway.
Right.
But they wouldn't be violent. They wouldn't be violent.
I don't know. Elliot,
but they would say,
I believe that all the reasons you gave are cover.
Right.
And that at the moment you have a small minority of Israelis in the settler community who are motivated out of their sense of the covenant and what the land is and who the land belongs to and greater Israel and what God wants of us. And that when you have a fundamentalist view to that extreme,
everything else is blocked out.
Right, and you go to extremes that are as frightening from a fundamentalist Jewish community as they are from any fundamentalist community.
Right, I call it vitamin M. vitamin messianic delusion.
Okay, so I just want to say to you, I appreciate all the problems that you've described, and I don't believe they're really an issue. Because I believe that what you've said now is true. That if there were a popular prime minister and a Supreme Court that was not in some way viewed to be questionable, the settler community feels it is right, and that they are so frustrated by the violence they've had to endure. They are so upset that they were thrown out of Gaza that at the moment they believe that it's okay for them to dress in black headgear and throw stones at Palestinians and at fellow Israelis, whom they now believe do not represent the God of Israel who gave us this land.
Unfortunately, your summary is correct. But what I will say to you is that, well, let's pull back a little bit and let's look at the context. The context has to be what's happening with the Palestinian Arabs. I mean, the other part of the equation, we have an honest prime minister, we have a upstanding Supreme Court, we have a legitimate Knesset, and what's happening with the Palestinians.
It's just as bad, let's say.
Well, if it's just as bad, why would we want to pull out of Hebron? What would be the legitimate reason to pull out of Hebron if it's just as bad? Why should we be giving the enemy this crown of Jewish civilization in return for absolutely nothing? Why would we want to do that? So I mean, I think a lot depends. I think what Israel needs to do is make some tough decisions. We need to decide whether or not we'll ever cut a deal with the Palestinians, and if we can't cut a deal, then we as a society need to draw our own red lines about where we want to be. And if as a society we say, regardless of Palestinian behavior, we understand that Hebron is untenable, then as a society we will have to pull out of Hebron. And if we make that decision as a society with a proper referendum and proper legitimacy, at that point, those settlers who want will either, I mean, there are all sorts of options. You can always say, listen, see you later on. I mean, you don't have to start fighting with people. But I think all of this is for the future. And right now, making concessions on Hebron is grossly premature.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make another statement, and you tell me how close I am to accuracy from your perspective. The vast majority of Israelis at the moment don't really believe that there's an interlocutor on the other side who is in power, that there's a Palestinian power elite who is in a position to or who wants to make peace with Israel. But if there ever were a real chance for honest peace. And when people say to me, what do I mean by peace? This is what I mean by peace. No Israeli parent ever has to worry that his child will leave the house one day and not return. That it isn't about warm and fuzzy.
Right.
It's not about even tourism.
Right.
I don't care about how cold the peace is between Israel and Egypt. There's peace.
Right.
Peace means I don't live in fear and my children don't walk in danger. If the Israeli people, the vast majority of what you call the center, who's now moved slightly to the right, if there were a conviction that this could happen, that the vast majority of Israelis would say, you give them anything they want outside the Green Line, save the settlement community that's been built around the Ring of Jerusalem, the Malay Adumim and the Efrat. But in general, and not only that, we'll make some concession here ourselves. We'll give something of East Jerusalem. And not only that, they want East Jerusalem to be their capital. They can have East Jerusalem as their capital. That ultimately, the vast majority of Israelis are not willing to make the issue whether there are settlements on the West Bank for real peace. To what extent am I right?
The vast majority of Israelis want what we call 1967 plus. We want to have strategic control of the West Bank regardless of any deal. So long as we have a sense of security over the West Bank, we cannot allow a foreign power, a foreign army to be based in the West Bank. It's not a flat bit of land, as you well know. It's a strategic high ground. So on the basis of 1967 plus, with proper security controls in the West Bank and demilitarization of the Palestinian regime, I think most Israelis would put that idea of peace with those provisos above the value of maintaining settlements in Judea and Samaria. So the answer is a qualified yes.
On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most serious, 1 being the least serious. Ehud Goldwasser and Uri Regev are returned, but they're returned in coffins. The coffin event in the life of Israel in 2008, a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in seriousness?
Well, it was a tremendous mistake making that trade of releasing a terrorist for the bodies of these 2 soldiers. So in that sense, it was a 5. It was a major mistake on the part of our government to do that.
When the coffins are returned, and are Israelis surprised?
No.
Israelis knew they were dead.
Most Israelis knew, and certainly our security people knew.
How long did they know?
They probably knew from the time they did the analysis on the ground. Within a number of days, when they saw how much blood was lost in the original Hezbollah attack, they understood that there would have been no chance for those people to have survived.
Okay, and how about the average Israeli?
The average Israeli is manipulated by the media, by the...
You're the media.
I try to manipulate in a good way. But
Did the Jerusalem Post say, we believe they're dead?
We reported, we can only say what people are willing to tell us on the record. And we did report what was available on the record, that the assessment of the intelligence community was that these people were unlikely to be alive.
You actually said that?
We actually said that, and so did some of the other media.
So
but at the same time, they played up the idea of bringing the boys home.
If we were going to bring them home, even if they were in coffins, we want them home.
Not for the price we paid.
Yes, that's a different issue then. Then the question is, was the trade appropriate? And you're saying there's no question the trade was not appropriate, right. And you believe, Bubba, the vast majority of Israelis would agree with that.
I'm not sure that the vast majority of Israelis would agree with that, because Israelis, again, one reason is the sense that they lose all perspective when a prisoner is held. And there's a frenzy to do something, even if it's a body, to bring the body home or to bring the prisoner home. There's a frenzy that we can't understand, because these are people who, they serve in the army, their children serve in the army, their parents serve in the army, their neighbors serve in the army. And the idea that somebody would left behind, even a body left behind, is just culturally so abhorrent that they can't stomach it.
Mm-hmm. You wrote on your own blog about Gilad Shalit.
Yes.
And you were somewhat critical of, again, this idea that we should do anything to get Gilad Shalit back.
Absolutely.
Describe why.
Hamas wants for Gilad Shalit over 1,000 Palestinian Arab prisoners in Israel. These are the people who orchestrated or were essential to carrying out the Dolphinarium attack in Tel Aviv. They helped plan the Pesach massacre in Netanya. They blew up the pizza shop on Jaffa Street in Jerusalem, the Moment Cafe, buses, you name it. These are the most heinous crimes committed between the year 2000 and 2005. We lost 1,000 Israelis were killed. Now, you release the people who helped mastermind it. The suicide bombers are gone, but the people who sent them, who provided the logistics, who drove them to their attacks, who ordered them to go in the first place, these are the people now sitting in Israeli jails. And if we let them out, not only are we committing a crime against the 1,000 who were murdered, but we are setting the stage for a bloodletting to come. And so it's not worth doing that. It nurtures the enemy, and we want to make the one thing they really want. You see, the one thing Hamas really, really, really wants is they want their prisoners, and that they shouldn't get.
Is there, in the Palestinian community today, a moderate wing somewhere buried beneath which really would want to live side by side with Israel in peace, even if it meant their own state on the West Bank would not have an army?
The only answer I can give you is what Mahmoud Abbas, who appears to be the champion of moderation among the Arabs, says. Abbas says he wants the right of return. Abbas says he wants Israel to return to the 1949 armistice lines. Abbas refuses to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And on top of all those things, Abbas has no influence within the Palestinian polity. That is the best prospect we have right now, is Mahmoud Abbas. So I'm not particularly optimistic.
Where were you when Israel celebrated its 60th anniversary?
I was in Jerusalem.
Okay.
I
From
had
an,
to think for a moment.
from an Israeli perspective, same question, 1 to 5. How important is it that we celebrated our 60th anniversary?
5. We were very fortunate. And please God, you know, may we all be able to celebrate the 70th and the 80th. Israel is a wonderful, wonderful phenomenon. We have so many problems that sometimes, and when people are you invite me to talk about Israel, what do I wind up talking about? I wind up talking about the problems. What I'd love to talk to you about is walking from my house to my synagogue on a Saturday and passing, you know, the beautiful hills and the blue sky and the perfect weather and being with friends and the good Israel, because that really is the Israel that most people would see when they come to visit and even if they come to live, right? But we wind up talking about the difficulties because Jews like to kvetch, and there's plenty to kvetch about.
Yes, but there is a gorgeous side of
There's a
Israel.
wonderful side. It is so, listen, I have a choice. I don't have to live in Israel, right? I can come back and live here. And that's true for, I think the best indication of why Israel is a wonderful place are the thousands, the tens of thousands of people who come from the United States and from England and from other countries in the West who choose to live in Israel because of the quality of life, because it gives meaning to our lives, because of the spiritual factor. It's a great place to live, despite everything.
Elliot Jager, I have loved meeting you.
Thank you.
Again, you're going to have to, it's only because you have to go that I'm going to let you go. I hope you'll promise to come back.
God be willing.
And not only that, if I make it to Israel in the near future with my wife, I really would love to meet you and your wife. I'd love to come to Tel Aviv, and I want to go to shul with you on a Saturday morning.
It's a deal.
It's a deal.
It's a deal.
Kol tu v'hatzlacha. May you only go from strength to strength. Continue the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And those were the thoughts of Elliot Jager, editorial page editor of the Jerusalem Post. And I would strongly urge you to visit his website entitled The Jager File at www.elliottjager.com. Of course, as always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed on this edition of Israel Speaks. Please email me or write me this week. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.